Welcome to another broadcast of Truth Be Told, where we believe in experience becomes truth. I'm your host, Tony Sweet. With me now in studio, because Captain Ron is not here this week, but we have the one and only intuitive Trisha Carr. You go to her website, TrishaCarrCharm.com. Today we're going to be talking about one of the most infamous serial killers that America has known. We are going to be talking about Charles Manson through the research of author Neil Sanders. You can go to his website, neilsandersmindcontrol.com, and find his book talking about what's the myth and what's fact in the story of Charles Manson. What were the true motives behind the murders and who really was involved? Through hundreds of hours of research, court and police documents, we're going to get the inside scoop of Charles Manson and the Manson family. So please welcome to Truth Be Told, author Neil Sanders. Oh, wow. The crowd goes wild.
Wow. Thank you.
Hey, Neil, how you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
We are great. Trish is here with me, and I know he stayed up because he's in the UK, so he stayed up just for us.
Oh,
Trisha.
well,
Can
thank you so much. So honored. So nice to meet you.
Unless he's a party animal, he just now waking up.
Right, the other side.
right.
Yeah, I got up about an hour ago.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
see there. Well, this is going to be a great subject because out of 400 and some episodes of Truth Be Told, I've always wanted to do a show on Charles Manson, and
Yes.
Today is the day, so I'm excited about this. Well, first of all, Charles Manson, you know, he's still alive, still in jail, you know, after all these years. Many of his family, you know, part of his followers have passed away, but there's still many that are still alive. Everybody's still fascinated with Charles Manson. I don't care what age you are. If it's older than us, my age, younger, people are still fascinated with Charles Manson.
He's like a living boogeyman.
Right. So I want to do just a quick briefing of, you know, how, because you're in the UK, how did you get interested in a kind of American icon?
One of our weirdos.
Yeah, one of our weirdos.
Well, I've always been interested in weird stuff, but as you say, Manson has sort of transcended the in a cultural sense beyond just a sort of normal criminal or a thug or a murderer or whatever. To become, as you say, a representative of something a lot more. He sort of taps into a lot of sort of fears that people have, and he's become a representation of that in many ways. I think what was interesting about Manson is that the timing of the murders, the brutality of the murders, who they were, and how this sort of refracted out through society. And the time actually that they occurred, in as much as this was supposedly very shortly after the Summer of Love,
right.
whether that is an accurate representation. I mean, 1967 was also known as the Long Hot Summer because there was over 1,800 race riots, serious race riots in the United States during that year alone. This was, very, very shortly after the murder of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, and various other Black Panther members were murdered around that time as well. So it was actually quite a sort of tumultuous time. What's an interesting sort of comparison is that basically the Golden Gate Park, the gathering of tribes for the human being that was in January 1967, as 30,000 so-called hippies or free love movement, or just teenagers essentially a meeting there for this fabulous festival. 30,000 American teenagers are sort of engaging in Operation Cedar Falls in Vietnam.
Wow.
At the very, very same time. So, this is the point about Manson. I think that he opens up sort of uncomfortable cans of worms, and I think actually that is my thesis on by sort of examining Manson is that actually the real story, as horrific as it is and as crazy as it is and as so fascinating as it is, isn't perhaps the entire truth, that there's a strong element of cover-up by the police and by the Hollywood establishment and by the prosecution certainly, in order to protect certain people involved in the crime, and to ultimately, try and divert attention from the seamier underside of Hollywood and the rich and the fabulous.
What's seamy? What?
Yeah, come on, fill us in on some of this stuff.
Wait,
Now you got my interest.
It's church here. What are you talking about? Yeah, we are, but I have to just say, dish. Who are they
Yes.
protecting?
Well, I mean, essentially, the crowd around the victims at Cielo Drive. Jay Sebring was not only hairdresser to the stars, but he was actually drug dealer to the stars as well. He was a cocaine dealer, and he dealt cocaine to all sorts of people: Steve McQueen and Dean Martin. And sort of the Rat Pack crowd. It's been rumored that he dealt to even the Camelot set, by which I mean, people connected through Peter Lawford to the Kennedy crowd and people like that. So he was, very well connected in that sense. Wojtek Frykowski, who was another victim of the murder, was trying to establish himself as the premium MDA dealer in the area. Who he acquired this from some Canadian drug dealers, essentially, that he'd met through parties at Roman Polanski's, and a friend of his called Ian Quarrier, and another gentleman called Witold Kay. And these were all friends with people like Mama Cass. In fact, one of the gentlemen that delivered the MDA to Wojtek Frykowski was named Billy Doyle, and he was a former dealer / enabling boyfriend of Mama Cass.
Oh, wow.
And some of the time, Susan Atkins would be knocking around at Mama Cass's as well, when she decided that she didn't want to stick to the strict vegetarian regime at the Spahn Ranch. So she'd go over there and have BLTs with Mama Cass. But this particular batch of drugs that Billy Doyle delivered to Wojtek Frykowski a few nights before the murder turned out to be a particularly bad batch, and to pay him back for this slight, Wojtek Frykowski actually invited him to a party at Mama Cass's house. When he turned up, he tied him to a tree, beat him, and raped him in front of the crowd, which apparently contained certainly Michelle Phillips and the Mamas and the Papas, John Phillips and Mama Cass, but very possibly Dennis Hopper as well.
Wow.
As he reported this to a number of journalists actually over the years. So this is the kind of crowd. One sort of contentious but repeated rumor about this particular bad batch of MDA was that it was sold on to this fledgling hippie couple, Tex Watson and Linda Kasabian. And it was due to this particular bad batch of MDA that they decided to go to Cielo Drive that particular night to enact what would essentially be a drug robbery. There is also a strong line of evidence that suggests that after Terry Melcher, who actually met Charles Manson in 1968, not 1969, a year before the prosecution claims he met him, because with Dennis Wilson's help and Greg Jacobson's help, they planned to make a documentary and tie it into an album, which was to be called The Manson Family Jams.
I knew that he, like you said, a lot of people didn't know that he wanted to be a singer.
Right.
Really bad.
Yeah.
I've heard that as well. Yes.
I mean, really bad.
Yeah.
But I mean, the rumor that the reason that, again, that Tex, and he admitted this, Terry Melcher actually admitted that Tex had been a guest at his house, but what was omitted from the trial was the rumor, which is, there's a lot of evidence to suggest it's true, that Dean Morehouse and Tex Watson actually stayed at Cielo Drive in the guest house in the period between Terry Melcher moving out and Roman Polanski moving in.
Okay, let's go back a little bit before the murders, leading up to the murders. I know that who was he hanging out with? I knew he was hanging out with some celebrities
Dennis Wilson and the
the Beach
people
Boys.
who would be knocking about with Dennis Wilson, the rest of the Beach Boys. He recorded an entire album. In fact, Nick Grillo, the manager of the Beach Boys, who was admitted to be connected to the mafia, he actually admitted that they had over 300 hours of unreleased Manson songs. And he recorded entire albums at Brian Wilson's home studio, which was in his bedroom. The only people that recorded there, other than Charles Manson, was Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys, because this was an incredibly exclusive place. It's because Dennis Wilson basically believed in him as an artist. He wasn't just Dennis Wilson. Neil Young tried to get him signed to Warner Brothers via Mo Austin, who was CEO or A&R at the time. And unfortunately, Manson had to turn this down because both he and Bobby Beausoleil, the plan was that they were both to be signed to Brother Records, which was owned by the Beach Boys, and they were to put out an album for this. And this was planned back as early as 1968. And at this time, basically, because Manson was a pimp and Manson was a drug dealer. I mean, like Manson's drug dealer clientele included Dean Martin, and this was admitted by friends of Dean Martin that basically, he went to Manson when he wasn't going to Jay Sebring because Manson, frankly, had better stuff. I mean, one interesting aspect that nobody seems to talk about, but it seems relatively plausible to me, is that his penchant for dune buggies whilst they were out in the desert wasn't just because he wanted to imitate Rommel or whatever the prosecution claimed, but they're a very handy type of vehicle if you wanted to get across the border, hypothetically, and pick up some drugs, hypothetically, and then get back and evade capture because they can go in areas that other vehicles can't go.
Right.
If you track Manson's sort of trajectory, if you sort of try and get a sort of accurate timeline of what the collective were doing, they're moving up and down the West Coast, going to Seattle, going down to the border. They'll go up and down the West Coast and go to Texas, go up and down the West Coast, go to Alabama, go up and down the West Coast, and then it's not entirely clear where they are, and essentially it looks like they're going to Mexico, or they're going basically to the places along the border in order to pick up whatever. And I think it strongly suggests that Manson was actually a pimp and a drug dealer. He was certainly a pimp before when he was in Hollywood, when he was in Three Star Enterprises, which was essentially a mafia-run operation. Well, certainly his partner at the time was Tony Cassini, who was proved by the FBI to be an active mafia member. Now, this is interesting because there's a lot of mafia association that runs through the story. Nick Grillo was associated with the mafia, Frank Sinatra was associated with the mafia, and he's sort of tangentially connected to the case, in as much as it was a former girlfriend of his that went to the police with Susan Atkins' apparent confession and the death list of celebrities that they decided to run. And because of these sort of, he knew Frank Costello in jail, he knew Frankie Carbo in jail, he was introduced, or at least recommended to play in clubs that were owned by Mickey Cohen, by Alvin Creepy Karpis, when they were cellmates in jail. He was visited by a lawyer called George Shibley just prior to his release, and George Shibley is like a sort of $250 an hour lawyer in the late 50s, early 60s, and it's never been explained who paid for this or why. He was running cars and women down to Texas. He then escaped to Mexico. You can't do sort of cross-state crime like that without the sort of tacit approval of a larger organization, basically. Otherwise, you get your head blown off. Right. And Manson himself has sort of suggested in a lot of interviews that when he was in Mexico in the late 50s or the mid 50s, he was actually moving cocaine around for the mafia, which would make sense. He also suggested it was sort of in and out of Miami as well, which at the time was sort of the conduit via Cuba. Which again would make sense. I'm not suggesting that Manson was in the mafia by any stretch of the imagination, but if you're involved in pimping and drug dealing and that type of thing, you rub up against these figures, and it's better to be favoured by them than not. but through this sort of influence, he was able to rub up with a lot of celebrities. He knocked about with Jimi Hendrix's band, like Noel Redding, Frank Zappa, apparently, Neil Diamond. He claims to have met. He spent a lot of time at Elvis's house, which in Los Angeles, and this was borne out by Michael Caine, who admitted in his autobiography that he was introduced to Charles Manson by Mama Cass at Elvis's house.
So I'm curious real quick because this guy's like what 5'3"? I don't know. He's really short.
Oh, he is? I never realized
he's
that.
really short.
He is a short guy. I don't think he's quite as short as they make out, but he is a very short geezer, yeah.
But I know he was quite a bit older than majority of the people in his followers. Do you feel that he was already in the business of prostitution and drugs before the Manson family got together?
Absolutely, yeah. Okay. Definitely, absolutely. He'd done it before. It's just basically, if you look at all the girls that he approached, even the lads, to be quite honest, they're vulnerable kids.
Right.
A lot of them had sort of criminal records at the time. Susan Atkins had pulled a gun on a policeman, for crying out loud.
Right.
Like, but the sort of the theme that runs through it is that these were sort of broken, disregarded, bright girls, but they'd been sort of rejected, and particularly rejected by their fathers. And one of the things that we know to be true is that one of the first sort of pattery things that he did was he made love to these girls, told them that they were beautiful, which possibly at the time a lot of them had not heard, and then also told them to imagine that he was their father. The unquestioning loyalty that the girls showed him initially, sort of, some of them continually, but initially, before the trial and such like that, although it was portrayed as a sort of a cult mentality and mind control aspect and stuff like that, I think there's an element of truth to that, but it also makes sense if you look at these girls as a harem of prostitutes, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you looked at the way they talk about it, and then you go and watch, say, a documentary like Hookers at the Point, or American Pimp, or any of these things, and the way that these girls address their pimps. He, to use the vernacular, he had a bottom bitch, which was squeaky.
Right.
Actually, a lot of the girls have talked about this, how he had what would be called front porch and back porch girls. And even in the sort of the accepted Helter Skelter story, it is shown that he placated certain violent elements like the Straight Satan's Motorcycle Gang with... for example, the drop and suck, which is essentially, sexual favors handed out by the most beautiful of his girls to, members of biker gangs or drug dealing gangs or gangs that he was involved in the production of pornography, which was shown to happen in Malibu and at Charlene Cafferit's house, who was a wealthy woman who, for some reason, sort of became enamored with them, and at the what became known as the Yellow Submarine House and places like that.
How do you feel? How do you feel he became such a mind manipulator?
I think it's just being older than them. As I say, he was 33, and they were all about 16, 17, 18.
Pretty easy.
These were very troubled kids.
Yeah.
He's a hardened criminal. He's been in and out of prison the majority of his life since he was a child, essentially. And I think it was really nothing more than influencing, kids who are naive and giving them the right cold-hearted prison patter. To tell them what they wanted to hear. I think that there is actually, and I'm not defending him by any stretch of the imagination, but I think there is a degree of taking care of the girls to a degree.
This is what gangs are. They have that mentality as well. How people get. I mean, it's interesting. People get jumped into gangs. They get their butts beat, and that's how they get initiated. But it's because there's a familial aspect that they've been lacking desperately in their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is the running theme. I mean, even sort of the people like, all the people like Tex, for example. Tex has claimed that he was like, his right-hand man and such like that. And he just, again, it's not borne out by the actual the timeline and showing how little time he actually spent at the ranch. The majority of the time Tex spent being a drug dealer and ripping off other drug dealers, not living at the ranch, not living with Manson at all. He bumped into... Here's the interesting thing as well. The evidence suggests that basically the story of how he met Dennis Wilson is not true at all. But actually he met him at Elvis's house, or he won a card game at Elvis's house against Dennis Wilson, and this is how he was invited to go and stay at Dennis Wilson's house, because he just broke up with his wife and frankly he was lonely. And here's a pimp with a load of drugs and a load of girls. You can come and stay with me if you want. And when he arrived, Tex was already there, because Tex was also a sort of minor drug dealer and possibly a rent boy as well.
So I'm sorry to be, if I'm digressing, but
No?
So why exactly would the police be in cahoots to, demonize him? Was he about to blow some whistles or something like that?
I was going to say, was it
No,
just to protect the
nothing like that.
celebrity?
They hated him because basically, you say he was a pimp.
Okay.
Like, there's something very, very strange about Manson.
Gotcha.
In as much as that he committed at least 6 felonies whilst he was on parole.
Yeah.
Like, which should have been immediate jail time. He broke conditions of his parole almost daily. He never had a job. He never had a place of residence. He was up for charges as serious as rape and statutory rape. And somehow he managed to evade capture all the time.
That makes sense.
And it's never been adequately explained as to why this was. One possible plausible suggestion is that he had some sort of influence to a larger organised crime syndicate, in as much as basically people were greasing palms and such like that.
Yeah. That makes sense.
That is a distinct possibility. So what's interesting about again, if you look at the timeline of the crime, it wasn't the police that solved, in inverted commas, the crime. It was a lad called Stephen Weiss who found the weapon, the gun. The gun, do you know, the gun that was actually used in the Tate murders used to belong to Ronald Reagan.
What?
That's
It was owned. It was used by him
weird.
on a film set, and it was given to Randy Starr, who was a stuntman on
It was
set.
a real gun? They used a real gun on set?
Well, it's like a sort of prop gun, which is why it was so inefficient. It kept jamming, and it eventually sort of broke.
Oh my gosh.
But it was used in the shooting of Lotsa Papa and the murder of Jay Sebring and Wojtek Frykowski. But yeah, so Ronald Reagan gave it to Randy Starr. And then Randy Starr gave it to Charles Manson in exchange for a truck at the ranch, and then Charles Manson gave it to Tex Watson. Wow. And this is how it was used. Another connection to Ronald Reagan, which is perhaps why, or certainly an element of why the police weren't particularly keen to solve the crime, is that among the celebrity porn films that were found at Cielo Drive, which were discovered by Detective Hal Lipsett, that trying to be sold by members of the LAPD, one of them contained Jane Wyman, who was the former wife of Ronald Reagan.
Right.
Yeah. That's
And also these tapes had a homosexual tryst between Yul Brynner and Peter Sellers, an orgy with Warren Beatty and Peter Sellers, and Mama Cass, the suggestion of bestiality films and interracial sex films involving Sharon Tate, which at the time was deemed quite,
that was a big deal, especially not just because it was barely legal for interracial marriage, but all of the race wars and race riots
absolutely. It was, as ridiculous as that sounds now.
It is, isn't it amazing?
That been a big scandal.
Yeah, that is.
It's kind of, I don't know what the date is, but interracial marriage, I think, wasn't it legalized in the 60s or something ridiculous like that?
I think so.
It's weird.
Yeah. It seems
Not
like
to
it
get
would
on
have
topic, but yeah.
So, I mean, the gun was found by a young lad called Stephen Weiss, and it was given into the police, who promptly lost it. And then the bloody clothes that were deposited by Linda Kasabian out of the car window, they were found by journalists. there was a lot of evidence that was basically, this crime could have been solved, but there was a lot of drugs flying around. And if you look at the initial police report, immediately they said this wasn't a break-in. This was somebody that knew the people. It looks like there was a drug deal that's gone down. It's gone bad. There's a murder, and that's what's happened. That's what it says in the police report. Okay. It wasn't until basically the young lad's father threatened to go to the papers that the police immediately suddenly found this weapon, and then miraculously after that, Susan Atkins, who's suddenly approached by two lawyers who usually their clients would be. This is Paul Crusoe I forget. I've gone simple. But these two lawyers, whose usual clientele basically was drug dealers and mafia people and that type of well-dressed Italian businessman type gentleman, and Richard Calabero was the other gentleman's name. They immediately approached Susan Davidson and decided to pro bono take a case. Immediately after that, she confesses to this woman who just so happens to have been a girlfriend of Frank Sinatra. And comes out with this story about how they murdered Sharon Tate. She'd actually been arrested because she was at the murder committed by Bobby Beausoleil of the. I'm sorry, it's late here and I've gone.
Oh, that's okay.
The guy who Manson slashed with the sword in the ear, their friend who was a music teacher who sold the bad mescaline to Bobby Beausoleil, whose name will come back to me in a moment. But essentially, these lawyers approached Susan Atkins, and her story was immediately sold by these lawyers to both the Los Angeles Times and then a publishing house who syndicated this as a novel called The Killing of Sharon Tate, which came out before the trial started.
Wow.
Basically detailing the entire story. That is outrageously unethical.
Right, absolutely.
Regardless, even if everything in that happened to be true, that's a ridiculously stupid thing to do in legal terms and in moral terms as well. Gary Hinman, that was his name. Sorry.
I have it right here. The Gary Hinman. I have it right in front of me. Sorry about that. I wasn't sure which one he was. So I want to know, in your investigation of this and your thesis of this.
Yeah.
So now Charles Manson was not on the property the night of the murders. Well, right?
He was later. He turned up about 4 a.m. When there were final gunshots were heard, which indicates that the story told by the prosecution was not true, and that Wojtek Wachowski and Abigail Folger, who was heard screaming at about 4 a.m, were actually killed when they went back. That it appears that in actual fact that the first person that was killed was Sharon, the second person that was killed was Jay. Then they left Cielo Drive and they went to they stopped at the Weber's house, and they stopped at the Weber's house about 10 minutes after the final shouting was heard at Cielo Drive. So it appears that they left in an absolute hurry, possibly leaving, probably by the looks of it, leaving Wojtek and Abigail tied up but still alive. Now, what's significant about the Weber's house, where they were shown to be apparently washing themselves on the way home, the Weber's house backs onto Jay Sebring's house. And Jay Sebring was known to be a drug dealer.
Right.
So what was the motive for the murders? Right. Well, the suggestion is that basically Bobby Beausoleil had been caught for the murder of Gary Hinman. The reason he murdered Gary Hinman was because basically he'd bought $1,000 worth of mescaline off Gary Hinman, which he'd sold to the Straight Satan motorcycle gang via a gentleman called Danny DiCarlo. Danny DiCarlo was the person who brought all the guns to the Spahn Ranch.
Right.
He basically was threatened by Danny DiCarlo and the Straight Satans because this mescaline apparently was tainted. And he was told that if you don't go over there and get either our money or the drugs back, we're going to kill you. And here's a gun to do it. Danny DiCarlo basically gave him the motive, forced him to do this crime, and gave him the weapon to actually commit this crime. Danny DiCarlo was the principal witness against Bobby Beausoleil at his trial. And we're starting to see where perhaps witnesses might have been corrupted to, create a narrative. So he goes along to Gary Hinman's house and asks for his money or the drugs, and Gary Hinman says he hasn't got it. And so they get into a bit of a row and a ruckus, and the gun goes off. And this sort of calms them down, and Gary Hinman says, well, tell you what, take my cars. I've got 2 cars, take those. They're not worth a lot, but they're worth just about $1,000. You can sell them, and that'll get everyone off her back. Brilliant. Unbeknownst to them, in the sort of melee, Mary Bruner's phoned back to the ranch saying, oh my God, it's kicking off here. Please come over and help us. So Manson goes white knighting it over there, basically knocks on the door. Gary Hinman answers it, and he smacks him in the face with a sword. Oh. He doesn't know that the whole situation has been sort of sorted by that. Now, again, the prosecution said that they'd gone over there to steal $20,000 and to force Gary Hinman to come to join the cult, which didn't really exist. Mm-hmm. Now, this is not true, and he certainly didn't intend to murder them because he took 2 witnesses along. He took Susan Atkins, who was an idiot and a kleptomaniac, and Mary Bruner. And these were both good friends of Gary Hinman. That's why they went. They didn't expect there to be trouble. They were just sort of frightened by gangsters from the Straight Satans, essentially. Right. Now, previous to this, Tex Watson who's been kicked out of the ranch and basically told to go away because all he does is rip people off, and he's basically not a very nice guy. He's tried to rip off a drug dealer called Bernard Crow, or Lots of Popper, by saying, I've got some money for you, I've got some weed for you, give me the money, I'll go out the back and get it for you. And just never turns up. But he leaves his ex-girlfriend there as collateral. And Lots of Popper phones up the ranch and says, I want to speak to Charles, meaning Charles Tex Watson. Manson answers, and basically he says, look, you owe me all this money, I know where you are, I'm going to come over there and burn the house down, I'm going to rape all the women, I'm going to kill all the men, okay, unless you sort this out. So Charlie goes along there. Now here's an interesting thing. Charlie takes a guy called TJ Wallerman. If Charlie's this massive cult leader, right, okay, that can get people to kill at will, why does he have to go and sort out this Lots of Popper stuff?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Why does Susan Atkins repeatedly betray him? And why did they betray him at the trial? Why did they betray him after the trial? Why does Susan Atkins continuously get kicked out for doing hard drugs? Why does Tex Watson continue to get kicked out? Why did he kick out Paul Watkins and Brooks Poston? If he's this fabulous cult leader that's got all of this power over people, why is it him that seems to be sorting all this crap out? Like right. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. So basically, anyway, he ends up going over there, and in the confusion, he ends up shooting Lots of Popper. Now, this puts the dampers on everything, because Terry Melcher all of a sudden gets really, really nervous. Him and Greg Jacobson are friends with one of the guys who is there with drug dealer Lots of Popper. Why they knew a drug dealer, who knows? But basically, so they have to put a kibosh on the album, at least for the time being. So the album that was going to be put out through Brother Records for both Bobby Beausoleil and the Manson family jams is put on a hold. Recently as well, another of Manson's business enterprises, a thing called Helter Skelter, was also put on hold. I know Helter Skelter is supposedly this race war, right, where Manson and his family were supposed to go into the desert, commit murders to start this race war, the inevitable race war between the blacks and the whites. They go off into the desert, hide in the mystical, magical, bottomless pit until their numbers swell to 144,000, and then they come back and take their rightful place as the owners of the earth. The only problem with that is that's not Manson. That's Krishna Venter. Krishna Venter was a cult leader from Box Canyon that basically preached a race war between the whites and the blacks. And he and his followers, who were into drugs and polyamorous sex, they would go off and live in the bottomless pit in the desert, wait till their numbers swelled to 144,000 before they would come back and take their rightful place at the owners. So how on earth did this nonsense get appropriated to Charles Manson? This got appropriated by key witness to the case, Paul Watkins.
Why did he do that? He just wanted to...
Because basically the real, this is the point. The real reason for the murder was that Tex owed Manson. Manson was also all sort of in a bind. Once Bobby Beausoleil was arrested, he owed Bobby. He needed to get him either money for a lawyer or something to help him out. Okay, but in his mind, Tex owes him because he's sorted out that problem with Lotsa Popper. So he says, "Oh no, here you go, your problem. You sort this out. Get some money for Bobby. Okay, sort something out. Try and help Bobby out." Now he's been knocking around with this bird called Linda Kasabian, who's just stolen $5,000 from her ex-husband and 300 tabs of LSD, and recently
not good.
bought a load of bad MDA from this chap called Wojtek Frykowski. So what they decided to do is, according to William Scanlon Murphy, who was friends with the Beach Boys and apparently had intimate knowledge of the intricate details of this thing, they knew that a load of cocaine and LSD was going to be dropped off at Jay Sebring's for Jay Sebring that night. Because basically they were still annoyed with Wojtek, they figured that this is a good way to go over there and get them both. We're going to go over there and we're going to rob them. We're going to take all the money and the drugs, and we'll be scot-free. This is brilliant. If you look at the weapons that they took, you didn't take enough weapons to kill everybody there. There was machine guns at the ranch, like machine guns. There's a whole arsenal of weapons that they could have taken, and they took 3 book knives, one of which was proven not to have been used, which was Susan Atkins, which is interesting because it was found down the back of the sofa, which indicates she was sitting down.
Well, just because of time, I mean, this is going fast, and I'm finding this so fascinating.
Yeah.
So thank you for even just doing the research and putting the book together. But I want to go back to what you said, is you believe that Sharon Tate was the first one killed. Being that she was pregnant, why do you think that she was the first one killed? And
Because she tried to run.
Oh, is that why she? Okay.
Yeah, literally, that was it. It wasn't like a targeted murder. It was a drug deal gone wrong. The reason I think that she was killed first is because the police report shows that a woman's scream was the first thing, followed by a man, which was probably Jay Sebring, saying, "Oh God, please God, no, stop, don't." And this was about, I think it was about 1:45. And I may have got that completely wrong, but basically this was the first indication of violence, and this was followed very shortly by a gunshot. There was a large pool of blood on the front porch, which is never talked about, and this was shown to be Sharon Tate's blood. Then there's a smear pattern that runs back into the house and is knocked up against the front edge of this suitcase that was delivered to the house earlier in the day, which indicates that basically the corpse, essentially, of Sharon Tate was dragged from outside where it had laid, according to the police report, for some time, back into the living room where, and I don't even think that she was actually hung up at that point. I don't think it was until they later came back at about 4 a.m. when the police report indicates that there was more shouting, more screams, and more gunshots, that she was actually hung up. And the suggestion is possibly that the hanging was to try and frame some drug dealers, one particularly called Pick Dawson, and Billy Doyle. He was connected to Billy Doyle, who were the drug dealers that actually delivered the MDA to Wojtek Frykowski. And there is a suggestion that this possibly worked because Mama Cass actually went to the police in the days following the murder and said that she believed that it was Pick Dawson and Billy Doyle that had been involved in the murders.
Wow. So how did Roman Polanski kind of, this is the husband of Sharon Tate, and later on we kind of know his story, but how did he? How was his significance in the story?
Not really anything other than basically he happened to live at that house. Sharon wasn't supposed to be there. Sharon was supposed to be staying at a woman called Sheila Wells' house. In fact, what's interesting is she was visited every day by Robert Evans, the film producer, who was known to be connected to the mafia via his lawyer Sidney Korshak, and also known to be a cocaine dealer. He was also known to be connected to the murder of Roy Radin, a music via a drug dealer who was also connected to Mama Cass, called William Menser, who was also possibly connected to the Son of Sam murders.
Wow.
Now, basically, he actually visited Sharon Tate every day whilst Roman was in London filming, trying to get a film called Day of the Dolphin off the ground. But on that one particular day, he didn't visit. He didn't go to the house. He phoned. Now, what's interesting is that basically she said, I'm going to stay at Sheila Wells' house. Now, at the trial, Sandra Good and various other members actually approached the Tate family and implored to them that they were very, very sorry. They didn't think Sharon was going to be there. In fact, they'd phoned ahead to check. Now, that raises some questions. What's also interesting is when Roman came back, Robert Evans put him up in a suite at the Warner Brothers studio. He charged him for it, obviously, because that's what they do. Also, Rudy Altobelli, who owned Cielo Drive, sued Roman Polanski for ruining his carpet.
Oh, God.
But now here's the kicker.
God.
He didn't clean up the carpet or the door. He kept it, and the door is now owned by Trent Reznor.
Ew.
But basically, he kept the bloodstains on the carpet and would show it off to guests when he lived there later on.
That's
bad taste.
Yeah.
Well, here's an interesting thing, right? Okay, Rudy Altobelli, along with Robert Evans and actor Jack Nicholson, turned up at Cielo Drive on the morning after the murders, and apparently went in there to clean up.
Jack Nicholson?
Now, they obviously didn't clean up because they didn't get rid of any of the blood or anything like that. So what they were actually looking for or cleaning up is very interesting. There's also a suggestion that several people turned up at Jay Sebring's house the following day. The first person left looking rather happy. The second person left looking rather panicked. So, there are all sorts of unanswered questions, shall we say.
Well, it could be some of those celebrity porn tapes or something like
Absolutely.
that. Absolutely,
It
yeah,
could have been
exactly.
that. It could have been all sorts of things,
Right.
basically. But these are, again, this is the point. These are the elements that lead me to believe that basically, and say the way that the police handled the case, that they didn't actually want to solve the case. And when they actually did find out what had happened, they were like, we really don't want to proceed with this. This is going to open too many cans of worms. So Vincent Bugliosi was faced with a particularly difficult problem. This is why he approached Danny DiCarlo and Paul Watkins and came up with this cult idea. He took the concept of Helter Skelter. Helter Skelter, I never explained that. What Helter Skelter was a nightclub that Charles Manson opened up in the desert at Spahn Ranch. It was a gambling joint, an illegal gambling joint called Helter Skelter. And that's why the door that was taken from Spahn Ranch had Helter Skelter written on it. We know this to be true because the police shut it down a number of times.
Oh, wow.
I did not know that.
And so
basically, what Vincent Bugliosi's done, he's taken elements like The Family, Jams. He's taken elements like Helter Skelter, and he's taken Krishna Venta's story via Danny DiCarlo, who had federal charges pending against him, and Paul Watkins, who was frankly an attention seeker. Susan Atkins had basically been coerced into telling this ridiculous story of cult murder and stuff by her lawyers in exchange for not getting the death penalty. Very shortly after her grand jury deposition, she basically recants the entire thing and says that she did, that she was told to make this up by the lawyers, and it wasn't true. She later released a book called The Myth of Helter Skelter, which essentially said that it was a drug deal gone wrong and elaborated on that, but this was largely ignored. At which point the prosecution approached Linda Kasabian, who seconds before she was offered immunity was up for 7 counts of murder.
Wow.
And then immediately, if you look again at the evidence of the timeline, I think it was Linda Kasabian that actually attacked Stephen Parent, who was the young lad who was killed in his car outside Cielo Drive, because she was outside. Now, the official story says that Stephen Parent was killed at 11:45, except his watch, which was stopped when the knife went through it, says 12:15, which, if you look at the police report, indicates that basically Tex and those people arrived, were chatting inside. A phone call was made to Witold K's house, which indicates that the phone line was actually cut afterwards. And what's interesting is that the cut screen, apparently, which was indicative of burglary or break-in, was never actually mentioned in the initial police report. It was produced later, but it was kind of contradictory because there were 2 open windows right next to that window.
Wow.
Oh my gosh.
Well, we only have about 4 minutes left. I can't believe how fast this is going. I know Dean, he wanted to throw his 2 cents in, and I'm going to ask the question because he said that Dennis Wilson apparently died of a accidental drowning, but he wants to know, do you suspect foul play?
I don't know, to be quite honest.
It was
Dennis
in
was troubled
'83
because of
though.
his relationship
quite a
with
bit
Murray, his
Yeah.
father, and being ripped off by him.
Yeah.
He essentially wanted to leave the Beach Boys and go and live with Manson. There is a strong suggestion, and this is controversial, that basically him and Manson were lovers. Okay, now here's the thing, right? Okay, the Manson collective, family, whatever you want to call them, they had orgies.
Sure.
These
Oh,
were
I know, yeah.
bisexual orgies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dennis Wilson was involved in these orgies, which involved underage girls and boys.
Wow. Wow.
So, he was at least dabbling, which
Right.
was a big problem for the Beach Boys, to be quite honest.
Oh, yeah.
So it wasn't actually him that kicked Manson out. It was Nick Grillo. Nick Grillo threatened to have him sectioned. And
Yeah,
to
he
William
didn't like
Scanlon,
that.
William Scanlon Murphy basically was a friend for Dennis Wilson. He was chatting to him for a long time, and he planned to release a book which was never released called Live Freaky, Die Freaky. And in that, he was going to reveal all the inside stories. And Dennis had told him a few stories. He basically said that Manson didn't do it, and that he'd actually spoken in English pop magazines about this great new guy who's going to release called Manson, and he's got a group called the Family Jams, and he's like a poet wizard from the future, and like he's going to blow your mind, man. And like, so they were at least friends. What's interesting is, the sort of the end of the whole thing, when Manson turns up and basically he threatens to sort of kidnap Dennis's kid, and then gives him a bullet, and they get into a fight, and like, what's bizarre is if you look at that, it's almost like a very extreme lover's tiff if you sort of look at it.
Yeah.
Because
Dennis
there
was
was
very
nothing,
disturbed.
there was no
Right.
consequence
You
of
think?
it. It was all just as handbags, really.
Right.
But
Well, we're going to have you back some more. And the people that are listening to this podcast or watching us on YouTube, please go pick up the book. The book, it's 564 pages, over 200,000 words. This has taken him a while. So
Yeah.
so people can go to your website at neilsandersmindcontrol.com, and it's only right now on his website. So if you want to pick up the book, please go there. This is a fascinating. I mean, the people's names that you have mentioned, I have not heard in any documentaries or any readings that I've heard before. So very fascinating, because this does sound like people were trying to keep this under wraps for many reasons, from of him being a pimp and drug dealer, and then I'm sure a lot of celebrities did not want any of this to get out. So very, very fascinating, great work, and please come back. I hope you do.
I'd be delighted to.
Yeah.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
And so please tell us one more time where people can find you. Are you going to be doing any book signings in UK or anything?
Oh, I don't know. Nothing planned. I say it's just available from neilsandersmindcontrol.com at the minute. It's going to be on Amazon at some point in the future, and on Kindle as well. But it's just there at the minute. And people can get me on Facebook as well. And if they want to ask me any questions, I'm usually very open to that sort of thing. So
all right.
Well,
thank you so much, Neil. We really appreciate it. This is Neil Sanders, neilsandersmindcontrol.com. Thank you, and come back again.
Yeah, nice to hear all of this stuff. Really cool.
No, thank you guys. Thank you.
All right, talk to you soon. All right, well, we are out of here. We're going to have another show, but we hope you guys enjoyed it. Tricia, where do people find you?
It is TriciaCarCharm.com. That's my website. And then I am right here on UBN Radio on Sundays at 11 a.m. Pacific. So I hope you'll join me there.
Well, real quick, tell us about your show. Give us
my
about
show?
a minute.
Yeah, okay. My show is about, I'm an intuitive, I'm a medium, an animal communicator, I'm a spiritual teacher. And so I teach on all topics of metaphysics, spirituality, consciousness, all that kind of stuff. I have expert guests on, and sometimes we talk about things like ETs and stuff too, from that metaphysical, spiritual aspect, and we take live calls from the audience to offer intuitive readings and advice.
And you can go to truthbetoldwebtv.com. Check out all our upcoming guests. We have a lot of guests that are already booked for August and September, and Paranormal season is coming up for October. So we have a lot of psychics and some intuitive people that ghost stories and ghost hunters. So we hope you guys will join us for that. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Leave us comments. We want to hear of guests that you want us to have on the show. We always appreciate that. We've booked many guests that you guys have suggested. Listen to us on iHeartRadio, iTunes, and same with Tricia's show.
Yeah.
So anyway, we'll see you next time on Truth Be Told. Until then, have a good one.